Okay, well, welcome to Future of Faith by Edinburgh Interfaith Association and Edinburgh Coexistence Initiative. We always have a partner, another partner as well, and this week we have the Interfaith Youth Call all the way from the US, and really excited to go international this week. As I've been telling our panelists, we're now on week 26 of our live shows, which is incredible to think. Because we just started off with an idea and we're still going. This week we're not joined by Zain Hussein, as he is a doctor and doing very many things, often working at night. So he's but instead we have the wonderful Joanne, which is really exciting. Come with a different perspective and also gender balance as well, which is great. It's a great change. As usual, maybe we can start with a kind of introduction. We're talking about how faith can lead to like protests and to really achieving things in the real world. And maybe we can start with a kind of an introduction from all of us, as we always do, as to our upbringing, just something brief about our faith, about where we grew up, about how we got into interfaith work and what how our faith does have an effect on what we do, or have an influence on how we live our lives. Do you want to start, Joanne?
Yeah, sure. For those who've probably heard it a couple of times, including Josh, I'm Joanne. I'm an Anglican Christian and I'm Northern Irish. I grew up in a non-religious household and converted later on in my life. Although I was baptized, there's this weird dichotomy in Northern Ireland where you can be Protestant and not actually believe in anything for political reasons. You can Google it, not really worth going into. But I always remember growing up in this very religiously conservative sort of area, and these ideas of like hating the religious other and this real hatred for people that were different. And I never felt part of that. I always felt like it was so far removed from all of my values as a Christian that I couldn't really figure out how I could be a person of faith and the people of my faith who would have this sort of hateful outlook. And then I went to university, studied at the University of Edinburgh, and sort of started to meet other people of other faiths. And here I am, involved in interfaith organizations. And honestly, it has been such a blessing to meet other people of other faiths. It's totally reframed the way that I see the world and the way that my family sees the world now too. Meeting other people and sharing in their love of their faith or their religious background or their traditions has been honestly one of the greatest joys of my time studying here. And my involvement with interfaith groups like Coexist, which I'm now co-president of, has just emphasized the need for understanding to build peace between different religious societies and communities, and how important that is to like reach out and actually start the conversation with the other to build these bridges. That's just a very short introduction. Josh, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure, I'll go next. Again, people have heard my introduction many times, so I'll keep it brief, but I'm Josh. I grew up in the liberal Jewish tradition in South London. In London, in the South, there aren't as many Jewish people. There are fewer communities, and I grew up with a Jewish father rather than a Jewish mother, and my mum's German, originally Christian, and that came with a few challenges, because in the Jewish tradition, normally it's the mother who the Judaism comes from, and sometimes other Jews don't accept my Judaism. But I grew up in a very multicultural place. South London is very mixed, and I have had lots of Muslim friends and lots of Christian friends. But when I came to university in Edinburgh, I got to know IFA, and kind of it was the first time I actually worked in a group which tried to build bridges between different communities. And that to me was something really special, because there's no harm. There can never be any harm in speaking together and sharing experiences together. You can only achieve things, you can only get better, and you can only if you work together, then there's a lot more you can achieve. And I've had the best time working with Ian at IFA, and then this series has been a wonderful part of my week every week. So yeah, that's me. Do you want to go next, Sarah?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara. I was raised in Oman pretty much my whole childhood in the Middle East, and I'm now studying at the University of Edinburgh. And I came into these interfaith circles through coexistence last year. So I'm very happy to be here, and I really enjoy interfaith discussions. I was raised in a religious Muslim household, so my faith has always been a part of my life, really. But it definitely, I think, grew and strengthened coming here and being exposed to other faiths. Not that I wasn't before, but being able to partake in these discussions, I think, has really highlighted the value and the beauty of faith. So yeah, I'm excited for the discussion today.
Great. Thanks. Do you want to go next, Brian, from the United States?
Sure. Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm with Interfaith Youth Corps. We're based out of Chicago, Illinois, and we work explicitly in higher education, colleges and university settings, helping to train students to see themselves as interfaith leaders, but also working with the faculty and administrators to create programs and build the capacity in themselves to also do that work with college students. And for us, it's looking beyond the college years ultimately to what's the civic spaces in the careers that they choose, in the work that they want to engage in as adults, to help better their communities, better the people they work with, the civic organizations that they're a part of, so that we see ourselves as an interfaith America, not as a divided or divisive space. And for me, I come to this work being Roman Catholic and being raised in a very Roman Catholic community. I even taught Sunday school and helped, as an altar boy and all those kind of things that you think of with Catholicism. And in college, have a degree in psychology and religious studies, so kind of explored other traditions in my own kind of spiritual journey, but ultimately, came back to Catholicism as who I am and core to how I, in a way, translate the world through a lens of Catholicism, and just really relish the ability to use my values to find those shared common values with others of different traditions as a kind of a way to work through the differences by really focusing on the shared experiences first, and find that we have more common ground to build a friendship upon, or a relationship, rather than going straight for those really hot topics first and try to work through those, because that tends to not be the way to go about it in my experience. But really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Really glad to have you here. Cool. Sorry, Joanne.
Steph, do you want to go next?
Yeah, it's lovely to meet all of you, and thank you again for inviting me to this. Also, it's nice, Brian, that you're joining us from the US. It must be really early for you. I was just thinking. So my name is Steph, which means autumn in Hebrew. And I've grown up all over the place, basically, and I've always been a part of very tiny Jewish communities. So right now, I am a part of the northernmost Jewish community in Europe, which is in Trondheim. So it's very, very, very tiny. So I'm very used to kind of being in spaces where I'm the only Jewish person, or, there are lots of people from different faiths. And I think it was really exciting to kind of be a part of that at university, of creating these spaces. So setting up together with Sarah and Joanne and many other people, the Coexistence Initiative as well, was very, very rewarding. And I was also a part of the Jewish Society as an interfaith officer at university, where we also tried to create kind of interdenominational connections, which was very, very interesting in addition to that. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here and to hear from all of you.
Great. Thanks so much. It's great to have you here. And from as we have every time, it's always such a diverse group of people with different experiences, different backgrounds, from different countries, and so we all bring really unique experiences, which I think is the beauty of Future Faith and Interfaith Insights. So thanks again for joining us. You know, our theme today is from protest to progress, and if you look at any big non-violent protest leader that we've seen, many of them have some kind of religion behind them. They have their kind of the basis of their push for what's right stems from that faith, from that kind of commitment to a faith that they've either been brought up in or they've moved to. And I was just wondering, from kind of your experiences, how your faith has motivated you to kind of strive for something and to try and make a difference. I don't know if it's quite an intense first question, but I don't know if anyone wants to take that first.
I have to think about that. It's a very good question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's quite an intense question to start off, to be totally fair. Yeah.
I can take a stab at it if
yeah, please
we
do,
can
Brian.
start there. And I think for me, as I mentioned, being Roman Catholic, the tenets of Catholic social teaching have kind of been drilled into me as from my parents and some leaders in my local community, that the values of really caring for those in the margins and those that are poor, however you define poor, not just financially, but poor in spirit, poor in resources, what have you. Catholic social teaching really speaks to finding solidarity and working for the least among us. And I think having parents and friends who kind of created that mindset in the beginning for me led me down the path of community service and organizing to ultimately this work of Interfaith Youth Corps, where those values that began as a Catholic set of values in my bubble as a child, I've seen in other communities of faith since then, and have allowed for me to find that common ground across traditions, to say, oh, we also have a shared value of service. We have this shared value that compels us to do for the other as we do for ourselves, right? The golden rule. And I think that was just a driver early on as I've done my own reflecting in life. And I'll leave that there. I'm sure I have more, but I'll kind of kick it over to others to build on if they like.
That's really interesting, and I've always found it amazing how faith can frame those worldviews, and especially to want to help the other. I just think that's really amazing. When I first converted, I remember there being, I'm a Protestant, so I remember there being quite a conflict in me, because at least I know that within traditions of liberation theology in the Catholic Church, there is more of a push for social justice. Often, although the Protestant churches should be more freeform to these movements, or I guess, they don't really engage in needs that is often there in society, and don't often align themselves with these protests and movements to help other people. And I had the greatest blessing of, I'm an identical twin, and my identical twin isn't of a faith, but she's an amazing person and has always been there to tell me and inform me about feminism, LGBTQIA rights, the rights of people of color in the UK and in America, and of course Indigenous rights. And at least her experience of these movements has greatly informed my faith in the way that I read it, where I'm not often taught it in church, that to protest for these people, often it's kind of skirted around. But from my experience, just having these engagements with people who are in these communities and people who are allies to these communities has really shaped my response as a religious person.
think it's interesting that you also mentioned kind of the impact of family on our ideas of these kind of responsibilities. Because for me personally, at least, my Judaism comes, or at least originates, in a very cultural kind of perspective. And so my activism really stems in my personal kind of family's history as Jews. So my family were refugees from the Holocaust, and that really inspired me actually to go into international law, which is what I'm studying now. And there are organizations like René Cassin, which I'm involved with, which really try to tie in these historical experiences of our religion kind of as, more in a cultural sense maybe than a religious sense, in order to turn it into activism.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. As I was really fortunate that synagogue I was growing up in, I think it was around 2015 when we had this, what they termed the refugee crisis. I don't particularly like that word, but essentially more refugees were applying to come to the UK, and there was a discussion of, they faced a lot of difficulty from loads of different people. And I was really fortunate that I was part of a synagogue where they had a spare building, which used to belong to, I think, the caretaker. But being a very small community, we didn't need a caretaker anymore. So they decided to renovate this and create a house for a refugee family. And so that, to me, kind of married the faith side of me, the Jewish side of me, and the social justice kind of the ideas I was moving forward, and it kind of put them together and said they work together, they work as one in tandem. And so I can totally see what you're talking about, how those do work together. So.
It's interesting to hear everything you guys have said, because I think for me, in some ways, it's almost, at least for some parts of my life, has been the opposite in terms of the connection between faith and, my drive for activism or for social justice. I think that for the longest time, I struggled with this idea of, if you belong to an organized religion like mine, it's, I didn't understand why I couldn't believe something was right or wrong just for the sake of it being right or wrong. And I sometimes felt like it could be limiting. And I think that is still something that I'm learning and growing with. But I think as I grew up, I at some point had to accept that I am who I am, and I have certain, morals and beliefs. For example, the LGBTQ plus community is one that even though sometimes it can be, unfortunately, a bit of a controversial topic, I always felt like I didn't necessarily draw those ideas from my religion. Rather, it was from a human aspect instead. And so I think now, as a woman of faith, and I definitely am one, I think that I'm comfortable with being sometimes human first, and then being Muslim, and then being this and that. And I love my faith, but I've always had that another more core aspect of me come before that. And I wish I drew more from my faith, though, like you guys do. I love what all of you said about that.
It's interesting, though, to think whether, what comes first in a way, and if you can take this kind of human side of you to reinterpret your faith, or to find kind of an approach to your faith that works for you, like you've been saying.
Yes, like Joanne, you mentioned liberation theology. That's something, it's probably maybe a newer field in amongst particularly Muslim academics that have been developing this, but it's definitely an attempt and something that I can identify with and appreciate.
I know that at least liberation theology for me has been deeply enriching. I know that I said that my sister's experience has helped the formation of my faith into one of social action, and I appreciate that your faith might be more limiting with certain aspects, but I know that I certainly have struggled as well sometimes with certain passages and my own views, because I am a staunch feminist, till I die. and also a member of the LGBTQIA community. These are two identities that I can't escape, and I can't, disassociate myself from because of my faith. And I've often struggled with what the Bible says and what I think, but I totally agree with what you're saying. Like, while I was struggling with this, I definitely had to just take a moment and think, you know what, right now I have to just appreciate that I am human. I have to try and think of like this loving God. He doesn't want me to tear myself apart while I figure this out, and I am a human being who just has to exist as I am. And that's a very powerful thing to do too, is to admit sometimes when our faith is in turmoil, because that can often provide a lot of growth in faith. At least I found I've grown a lot from struggling with these issues.
Stav, the one thing I was wondering is you said you've lived in loads of different places and you always join like the small Jewish community, and I totally can relate because I've lived in different places. But when you move to a new place, do you find that you notice specific differences in like the perceived norms of the different communities? Like, are things different, or do you end up is there often an Orthodox Jewish community, or is there a liberal Jewish community? How do you kind of, how does that work for you? I'd find it really interesting to know how you go between different communities when you move.
I think it's very interesting because for me, I mean, it's a very kind of personal issue. So that's why it's also interesting to hear kind of Joanne speak about this idea of faith and our relationship to it. But for me, I think faith is also something very internal. And then there's organized religion, which is separate from that. So then we can kind of interpret organized religion according to our personal faith. Maybe it's kind of like a different kind of wording for the same kind of human faith distinction you guys were making. But then I think that I can kind of be in very different communities and just interpret the organized religion in my own way. So I really relate to kind of the local community here in Tunian because it's so small that it can't afford to have divisions. It's so small that we have to all get along and we have to all have just kind of one synagogue. Whereas it was also really nice to see in Edinburgh, when I moved there and suddenly see that there are 3 communities, like that was huge for me, There's like an Orthodox community, there's a liberal community, and then there's Chabad, which is ultra-Orthodox. So that was really interesting for me as well. And it was nice to see the kind of engagement of the different communities with each other. But I definitely like the fact that small communities do have to collaborate a bit more and work across those kind of organizational divides and have that shared faith in common. I really liked, I think in one of our coexistence chats, Estefa, I think, mentioned this really beautiful allegory. She said, I don't know if you guys remember, she said that faith is like fire, and then the different organized religions are like different fireplaces. And so I feel like we can just kind of light, the fire wherever we go.
I don't know how I forgot that.
Sorry. That suits when I was in Edinburgh, I was part of the small Sukkot Shalom community for a bit of time, and I remember it was such a small community, they didn't have a building where they could go and pray, and so they'd go to churches. And for some people, they would ask them, well, why do you go to a church to celebrate your religion? I was like, well, in a way, it's quite a nice, it kind of does show that in the end, religions are built on the same cause, and it's just about where the fireplace may be a bit different, but the fire is very similar. And so I've always tried to take it in quite a positive way that religions can work together, and in the end there's that core set of beliefs which are very transferable between the different communities.
I think this element of Sukkot Shalom is also very relevant to what we're talking about now as well, because I know that they have had many alliances with different Christian organizations in Edinburgh to work for example, LGBTQ rights. So working for civil marriage and things like that across faith lines. And I think that it's really interesting where we can use this solidarity to build something new, to build a better future.
Oh, Joanne, I think you're muted.
Sorry. I was just saying we got a question in, if anybody wants to tackle it, from Joe. Does faith require protest? And are there examples of faith without protest?
Again, might need a couple of minutes, right?
I could give my 2 cents on it, just personally first, and let you guys think about it for a minute. Personally, for me, where I'm coming from, I can't see my faith without protest. Not sort of, protesting against anybody that disagrees with me. I just mean that when I look at the person of Jesus, I don't see someone who conforms to societal oppression. I see someone who calls it out. And at least when I see other faiths, I see this, if we're going to look at how faiths emerged, maybe in a more secular way, faiths kind of have this common thing where it's like looking after the little guy. And that's a big generalization. But at least most faiths that I know at least comprehend that there is someone who has it worse than us, and we have a duty to them to do better. And I think that while there are examples of how to do this without protest, that's sort of an individual way to that. From my point of view, that's a very individual way to solve a much more macro problem, which is systemic. And protest at least allows us to break down these systems that hold people in oppressive regimes, like, for example, the fact that women weren't allowed to vote, weren't allowed to work and stuff like that. Suffragettes allowed us to do all that, although there could be lots to do to allow women to maybe have more say in the house. There was a need for a complete structural change in that sort of example. But I'd love to hear your points of view also.
I agree. Oh, sorry.
I'm
Sorry.
so sorry, Josh. No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay. I'll give my 2 cents, as Joanne said. I think I agree. Protest as it in a way that it's just faith is something different, but they work together. So, like, as I said, I grew up in a liberal synagogue, and I struggled. It was interesting because because I have a mixed family, it took me quite a while to realize that I wanted to be Jewish. I wanted to have a bar mitzvah, etc. And for a while, I struggled to kind of work out how my faith would fit different things I believed in, like equality for women and so on, because every community does struggle with this. But I was lucky because the community I came into was so liberal and open-minded that the rabbi happened to be a woman, which to some people may seem like not much at all, but it was a huge change to some of the synagogues where members of my family had bar mitzvahs, where men and women were separated. And while I kind of, I didn't feel comfortable there, I let them do their thing, but I wanted to go somewhere where the religion did meet my social values, and in that sense my faith was a protest. Like the fact that I joined the synagogue was a protest, and it was like showing that faith communities can change and they can make that difference. So
I loved what you said, and I think it's so important to have those. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but I can definitely say, as a person of faith who belongs to, like a community of faith, it's so nice to have those examples of people where it's different and you feel like we're moving forward, and that's really nice. And I had 2 things to say. One thing is a very general comment, since I think, at least this may not relate to every religion, but I think of the religions that we all subscribe to here, one thing that I've always found fascinating is that each of our religions were established with struggle. And I feel like that there was a spirit of protest, or a spirit of going against the status quo, or a spirit of liberation that needed to happen in order to establish each of those religions. And so I think that from the beginning, that spirit was already there. And once we become organized communities, the religion will, of course, develop. But there was always that spark that is needed. And I think that is very powerful. And specifically in my religion, I'll just very quickly narrate a very definitive moment in like very early Islamic history. This is probably 50 or so years after the Prophet's death. And you have an instant where his own grandson, and so his grandson, his family, is massacred by the Muslim ruler. At that time, there was quite an empire, and he was massacred by the Muslim ruler. And this was a very shocking event to have the Prophet's own grandson treated like this. And it's a very definitive moment and very important for all Muslims in different ways. The event is interpreted in many different ways, but one way that people see it as is his grandson Hussein had to sacrifice himself for both the sake of the faith, to keep it alive because it had been corrupted in those 50 short years after his grandfather's death, but also for the sake of earthly justice. And he had to oppose the ruler, even though the odds were stacked against him. And by doing so, the tyranny that was, lying beneath this, glorious Islamic empire needed to be exposed to everybody. And so it's always a struggle. And so for me, to answer the question, does faith require protest? I think it definitely does.
I love everything I'm hearing. I totally agree. And I think for me, I often personally reflect on what protest means, because protest can mean very different things and manifest itself in different ways. And to your point, Sarah, the beginnings of faith, I was thinking the exact same thing. So many faiths, not just out of the Abrahamic traditions, but I'm thinking of the monks during Vietnam that set themselves on fire, and other protests that exist. There's just different types of protests and different ways that faiths compel people to act on the values to demonstrate their commitment to their worldview and who they are, but also to demonstrate to the world what's going on and bring a kind of a message of something's not right here, and I need to act on it, and my faith is calling me to act on it. But I also think, as I think about the work that we do with students, very rarely do we have just a student on a campus that is doing something for interfaith engagement. They generally have a team, or they're working with a mentor, or a faculty advisor, and that differences of faith, but also differences of personality, allow for kind of the movement of the protest to grow in different ways. And I'll often do a workshop where we kind of do asset mapping, where we talk about just the ripples of impact that individuals have. And while I might have a set of ripples that emanate from me in my work and in my community, you standing 2 feet next to me are going to have different ripples and impact people different ways. And so how we work together to protest, whether we come from a similar worldview and faith or not, allows for messages to be heard differently, and allows for the faith to even be seen differently, so that it's not just Brian as a Catholic, it's other Catholics or other individuals that are demonstrating their faith around a core issue or core concern, like feminism, as you were saying. Like, how are these people of different backgrounds still coming to the same conclusion, or coming to a space of common ground? And I think that's where the impact of interfaith cooperation is so critical to protest, right? Because it's showing that it's not just one side or another side. It's that there's multiple people experiencing a struggle and acting out in a similar way, maybe not the exact same, but a similar way.
I think it's really nice how you all mentioned different kinds of protest as well. So for example, like Josh said, even being in a certain space in itself can be an act of protest. Even engaging with other perspectives, like you're saying, Brian, can be an act of protest as well, in many ways. So it's interesting how we can take that into our daily lives, not just in kind of the more traditional forms of, going out into the street or making a post, I think, as Joe mentioned, on social media, but actually just engaging with this on a daily personal level.
Sorry, I have one more thing to say. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much on this question, but I also think it's important to remember that protests need different people. So you need someone at the front of the crowd or the front of the march, but you also need people back, making sure people get fed and are keeping the spirit alive, not just being the kind of the person at the podium. And I think that's another piece where the values of a faith, what if a worldview compels you to do, manifest as well. Because I think just thinking of Jesus, there's definitely times in the Gospels where we read about Jesus stepping up and talking to the crowd, but then there's also the time where he's quietly washing the feet of his companions or helping people out and feeding the crowds with the loaves and fishes story. And so to paint one person in as one protester or one type of another protester is, I think, doing a disservice to our history and the richness of the traditions we come from, but also does a disservice to the many skills and traits that we all have to be the leaders that we need to be. Because if we're only leaning into one skill or one aspect of our leadership, then we're not being fully human and fully expressive of what we can contribute. And so obviously we have the skills that we're good at, and I'm not saying like try and force yourself to be a leader in another way, but as the three of you with coexistence work together, like you demonstrate clearly different aspects of worldviews, but also personalities to bring a richness to the larger protest that you may be a part of, just as an example.
I really like what you said about like protest about creating society and creating community and a multifaceted community. I definitely when I think of especially through like a liberation theology lens, it seems that like that's often it paints my worldview, a liberation theology sort of idea perspective, how protest can then impact a wider societal reading of faith and how we value one another as intrinsic parts of this machine to help other people. And I think that's really amazing, honestly. I don't really have much of a reflection other than that. I just found that really inspiring.
I think it's beautiful. I think that interfaith solidarity can. Oh, sorry, Josh, were you going to say something?
No. I was going to say thanks, but you've.
Lagging, yeah. No, then I think that the interfaith solidarity can play a very large part in that, as well of that enriching of each other. So, for example, here in our small community in Trondheim, I believe it was in 2015 when there was a terrorist attack on the synagogue in Copenhagen. And when that happened, local Muslim communities, both in Trondheim and in the other Jewish community in Oslo, stood around the synagogue and held hands in protection of it and in solidarity between two minorities in the country. And in a similar way, last summer, when there was a terrorist attack on a mosque in Oslo, we stood outside the mosque during their Friday prayer to show solidarity with them. So I think it's really beautiful how, just how interfaith can be a part of this solidarity.
We have another question as well from Ruhi that I feel like in answering, I can add on to that about thinking about nonviolent protests today as it's movements like BLM, Extinction Rebellion. What role do you see peaceful protests playing in progress and social change? I think with your examples of how the communities have protected each other and allowed each other to be this larger protest against religious fanaticism, thinking back to the civil rights movements and everything, and how Malcolm X and Martin Luther King come from completely different religious points of view, but come together to achieve this, which is rights for Black people in America. Arguably, not enough has been done in the law to change that, but they have put the foundation for more Black activists to come and make change today, and we've seen it very recently. Thinking of nonviolent protest, I definitely think that there's a role in it for creating community and protecting community. I think that peaceful protest is a great way to be seen. And I think that if I'm thinking of Martin Luther King, he originally, and that's important, was a very big advocate for peaceful protests, just because it allowed people to sympathize with the cause. Because often when there's a large movement within society and there is structural bias against the movement, what's needed to be seen is sort of a common humanity. And I think that's important. However, I know that there's definitely been a debate with BLM, and I've seen it all over social media, that the violent protests has completely destabilized any sort of meaning, and I completely could not disagree more. And you're welcome to disagree with me. I'm not gonna like cause a row about it, but I think as well there's like a huge place for showing, for understanding, even if we don't necessarily condone religiously violence against people and against institutions, how and why these violent protests happen, in order to understand the societal conditions and then lift those people out of those conditions as religious people, trying to liberate those people from the conditions that have caused them to resort to violence in order to get their freedom. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, I think I totally agree. Actually, I did history at university, so I'm a bit of a history buff. But like, I also think the history of religion, as you said, is history of struggle. But that's also is sometimes armed struggle, and you have to accept that. So, for example, the Jews in ancient Rome, you know, going all the way back, you know, we're talking centuries. There's always a base there, and you have to accept that people were put in those situations, and as you said, work with them to help get out of it. And I always, my dad actually turns out to be South African, and every time I talk to him about, you know, the fight against apartheid, he grew up during apartheid, we talk about the different faith leaders who stood with Nelson Mandela, the lawyer who represented him at the Rivonia trial happened to be Jewish, and he was one of his accomplices was Ahmed Kathrada, who, you know, is also religious. And there's a strong sense that in our history, religious groups have shown that they can stand together and they can fight for what's right, and that to me is just a huge inspiration. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how that's happening today as well. So actually, I was just reading Avi Dabush, who's the director of Rabbis for Human Rights, which works for kind of human rights in the Palestinian-Israeli context. And he was talking about this idea of creation as an idea of organizing together, and the story of creation with Cain and Abel later taking place, actually showing how oppression really doesn't have place in a non-heavenly world, so in the world that we're given, in a sense, because they're the first two people that are created outside of heaven. And he really draws throughout all of this analysis on the thinking of Reverend Alan Bosak, who was also an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa. So it's really interesting how all of these kind of liberationist theologies can inform each other.
Well, then here in the States, I mean, I don't know how much you follow our politics, but you know, we're heading into a pretty massive election and lots of protests, lots of discussions going on. And at IFIC, you know, we're partnering with a couple of organizations, one of which is called Braver Angels, where their stance is kind of like, we're part of the protest, but we come after the protest. And many of the students that I've worked with, you know, are on the front lines doing the great work of bringing attention to things. But then, you know, what comes after the protest, like the progress piece is, you know, what's the dialogue that can be built? How do we reopen lines of communication, if even when they appear to be severed? Because I think that's the piece of protest that often sometimes gets lost in the history, so to speak, of, you know, the March on Washington by Martin Luther King was great. It was epic. It's iconic. There's all sorts of beautiful imagery, but it's all the work after that, right, that brings about the legislation. Like it's the SNCC and the protests that went on the counters and across the South with the boycotts, all epic and wonderful and needed to happen. But it's that work after the fact. It's the fact that, you know, John Lewis was involved in politics and for decades after that, working to create systematic changes across laws rather than just saying, okay, I did my protest, now I'm done. It was the longer work and the harder work that comes with building those relationships afterwards. And I think that's the piece that we at IFYC are trying to situate ourselves as to saying, yes, protests are important, but leading with relationship, finding the humanity and the common ground that we have with one another is ultimately where it's at. Because I mean, you mentioned, you know, the rebellion, Extinction Rebellion, excuse me. We only have the one Earth, right? Like ultimately, we all, like, common denominator is time and the planet we live on. And so how do we build from those common core realities to maintaining friendships, relationships, what have you, even if we're coming at, you know, an issue from very different directions sometimes.
I guess I have a final question with Extinction Rebellion. It's something very current and that way more religious groups should be involved in, but aren't. With how more violent protests tend to get a bit more work done, like LGBTQIA rights were kind of secured through protests that happened that were violent. Same with women's rights and suffragettes, the bomb in Parliament and everything. While they are not at all ideal, and I don't condone violence in and of itself for the sake of violence, is there an argument to be made that something like Extinction Rebellion is too passive? Because it kind of gets people to think about it too much and doesn't hammer home the seriousness of us living on the one Earth. What is your thoughts on that?
So what do you mean, Joanne, when you say that it's too passive, in the sense that people focus too much on the kind of external facts of their activism rather than on their message? Or I'm not sure I understood.
Oh, okay, sorry. I mean that with Extinction Rebellion, it's from what I've seen, it's very focused on like organizing very peaceful demonstrations and picket signs and stuff like that. But there isn't as much pressure behind the government from organizations like Extinction Rebellion as there has maybe been, arguably, by historic protests that have taken a more violent route. Is there something to be said about forming a new way to push these protests forward that doesn't involve violence? Are they paving a new way for protest? Or is it maybe that they're not going far enough to hammer home the seriousness of One Earth by trying to be palatable?
I think to a point we have in my opinion, opportunity to use types of protests which weren't available before. So for example, video and social media can be a real tool for pushing a protest, and we didn't have that 80 years ago. And there are tools there to be able to put out your message, and things like marches I really do think can have a strong effect. So we mentioned the March on Washington, the March on Selma. I watched the film Selma the other day, and I'm still kind of reading from it. I really do think that's a mix of things like protests, like demonstrations, and then things like social media and videos, and so on can really spur a movement like Extinction Rebellion on. I mean, but I'd be happy to be counted by anybody.
I think that's a really nice perspective on it, actually, about the different forms of protest that we have available to us, and mixing it up and using the resources that we have to us. Like, for example, with social media, the way that we can push, say, I'm forgetting words, signatures,
Petitions.
petitions. Thank you so much. Had a complete blank. But yeah, we can push things like petitions and learning resources to actually counter bigotry with individuals on a much larger scale, which is hugely impactful. And also getting stuff like this debated in Parliament without actually having to pressure the government is amazing that we can do that just through social media.
And also, I think what we were talking about earlier, right, connecting with other people's narratives, being able to see the world from someone else's point of view is much more accessible in many senses. Although, of course, then there are the issues of, you know, what social media do we see? Do we get kind of sucked into a vortex of an echo chamber? But you know.
I feel like we could spend another few hours
Yeah.
debating echo chambers, and I have done that before. So, but well, I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been a really interesting discussion from so many different people, from different backgrounds, different places. Thanks again, Brian. Maybe you can get a bit more sleep now.
Yeah, I'll have a morning nap later.
But it's been a really, really great show. I've had the privilege of running these. I wasn't sure whether I should mention this, but unfortunately it's my final Future Faith now, which I'm very sad about. Extremely sad about. I'll be starting a new job in November, meaning that I'm going to have to pass the reins on. It's been an absolute privilege to meet great people and to talk about the issues of our time, and I still count as a young person apparently, so I get to lead Future Faith. But thanks to everybody for tuning in. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you all
so much, John.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Joanne, for inviting.
No problem. Thank you for being here, everyone, and for the really enlightening discussion that we've had.